It's funny, the kind of quiet that settles in after something utterly monumental happens. That Friday afternoon, after 31 years of building a career, 22 of them with the same company, I walked out of Meridian Defense Solutions into a silence I hadn't known existed. Not the literal absence of sound, but an internal stillness. My wife, Eleanor, met me at the door, her eyes reading everything on my face. She didn't ask a single question, just held me and made dinner, letting me sit with it all on the back porch as the sun dipped low. The next morning, for the first time in 15 years, I slept in. No alarm, no urgent emails, no 6 a.m. calls about server outages or compliance deadlines. Eleanor made pancakes. We ate on the back porch, just like we used to before the kids moved out. She asked what I wanted to do next. I told her I didn't know, probably rest for a few days, then figure out the next chapter. What she didn't ask was why I seemed so calm. 35 years of marriage, she knew me well enough to recognize processing from panicking. This was processing. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A text from David Jenkins, my deputy for over a decade. His message was short, cryptic: chaos here. Blake just realized something about the DoD contract. Won't say more, but thought you should know. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The dominoes were already falling, exactly as I'd known they would. See, 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday, I was in my office, reviewing network segmentation protocols. This was the unglamorous detail work that kept everything secure. Blake Harrison, the new 28-year-old IT director, leaned against my doorframe. He was all casual confidence, the kind that comes from never having faced real consequences. He'd been brought in by our new CEO, Marcus Thorne, to modernize things. Marcus, an MBA from Wharton with zero technical or government contracting experience, had been instantly charmed by Blake's buzzwords: AI integration, zero trust, cloud-native solutions. Blake had been with us just a few weeks. He'd breezed through the building, full of big smiles and talk about disrupting the status quo. He saw my framed certifications, my stack of manuals, my Air Force commendation, and with a slight chuckle, called my office setup very retro. I let it go. Figured he was just young. Over the next few weeks, Blake started making changes. He replaced our ticketing system, restructured reporting lines, proposed sunsetting our on-premise backups for cloud storage. He suggested eliminating manual verification steps in incident response and outsourcing overnight monitoring to a vendor in Mexico City. Each idea came wrapped in a slick presentation, showing massive ROI. What those presentations conveniently omitted was context. The on-premise backups were non-negotiable for classified data. The manual verification steps were contractually required. The overnight monitoring couldn't be outsourced because the personnel needed clearances that foreign nationals couldn't obtain. I brought these points up in every meeting, politely, professionally, with documentation to back me up. Blake would nod, thank me for my institutional perspective, and then move forward, making minor tweaks to avoid the most obvious compliance violations. He saw bureaucracy, I saw survival. He saw resistance, I saw protection. In April, Blake submitted his grand proposal, a complete overhaul of our cybersecurity infrastructure. He promised $2.3 million in annual savings. It was technically impressive, but utterly impossible under our current contract requirements. Half the systems couldn't leave our physical control. His AI tools weren't certified. His automated compliance features would violate oversight protocols. I pointed all this out in the review meeting. Calmly. Professionally. With specific contract citations. Blake's expression flickered, just for a second. Then he smiled. Said he appreciated the feedback, but felt we were letting legacy thinking limit our potential. Marcus, our CEO, nodded along, talking about balancing compliance with innovation. Blake didn't look at me on the way out. 2 weeks later, the call came. Marcus's office. Brenda from HR was there too. Never a good sign. Marcus spoke of restructuring, flattening hierarchies, making room for new talent. My position was being eliminated. I just sat there, processing. 31 years of service, 22 at this company. Perfect reviews. 3 commendations from government clients. And I was being cut loose because a 28-year-old thought I was redundant. Then Blake spoke. His voice was measured, but there was a smugness underneath. He talked about the evolving cybersecurity landscape, about needing people who could adapt to modern paradigms. He said my skill set was valuable, but no longer aligned with where they were heading. And then he said it, the line I'll remember forever. We don't need a 60-year-old overseeing cybersecurity. He actually laughed when he said it. Like it was obvious. Like my age was the whole argument. Like 6 decades of life experience and 3 decades of specialized expertise were disqualifications, not qualifications. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Brenda stared at her notepad. Nobody defended me. Nobody pushed back. Blake leaned forward. Hand over your badge. So I did. I unclipped it, laid it on the desk. I didn't say a word about the Sentinel contract, the $17 million Department of Defense deal that was Meridian's bread and butter. I didn't mention that my TS/SCI clearance was the only thing keeping it active. I didn't explain that terminating the cleared architect of record required 90 days' notice to the contracting officer per Section 4.7.2 of the agreement. They hadn't asked, and I wasn't in the business of doing free consulting for people who had just fired me. Brenda handed me a folder, severance terms, 2 months' pay, benefits. I signed everything, shook hands, and walked out. My desk was already being cleared by security. Standard procedure for terminated employees with clearances. I grabbed my personal items, photos, the coffee mug my daughter Sarah made me in middle school, the small wooden box Eleanor gave me for our 25th anniversary. David caught me in the hallway. His face was pale. What happened? Restructuring. Blake's vision doesn't include people like me. David's jaw tightened. That's insane. You're the only one who, I know what I am, I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. You know where to find me if you need anything. I walked out of Meridian Defense Solutions at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday. What Blake and Marcus didn't understand about government contracting is this: every major defense contract has key personnel clauses. These name specific individuals whose qualifications and clearances are essential. Remove them without proper notification and approval, and you're in breach. The Sentinel contract had 3 key personnel listed: the program manager, the lead systems engineer, a woman named Susan Chin, who'd been there 16 years, and the cybersecurity architect of record. That last one was me. Section 4.7.2 was explicit: any change required written notification to the contracting officer at least 90 days in advance, with justification and a transition plan. Blake had fired me with 0 notice to anyone outside the building. He'd also created another problem: the contract required continuous active status for that architect. Any gap, even a single day, triggered review. If the gap exceeded 72 business hours without remediation, termination for cause was an option. By Sunday evening, I had 17 missed calls from Meridian numbers. I let them all go to voicemail. Monday morning, I was reading the newspaper on the porch when my phone rang. This time, it was a number I recognized: Richard Stone, the DoD contracting officer for Sentinel. I answered. Mr. Miller, his voice was tense. I've just been informed of your departure from Meridian Defense Solutions. That's accurate, I told him. He paused. Did you resign, or were you terminated? Terminated. Friday afternoon. Position eliminated as part of a restructuring. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Miller, are you aware of the key personnel requirements under Sentinel? I'm very aware, I said. I was the architect on that contract for 7 years. And Meridian notified us of this personnel change? You'd have to ask Meridian that question, Mr. Stone. I wasn't privy to their communications after my termination. Richard sighed, a heavy, tired sound. Mr. Miller. We received no notification, no replacement credential, no transition documentation. As of this moment, Meridian is in material breach of Section 4.7.2. I expressed my sympathies. Told him I hoped they could work it out. 20 minutes later, another call. Marcus Thorne. I let it go to voicemail. His message was borderline frantic. Said there'd been a misunderstanding, that they needed to discuss the situation urgently. Said my expertise was invaluable and they wanted to explore options for continuing our relationship. Translation: they just realized they were about to lose $17 million, and I was the only person who could save them. I didn't call back. By Monday afternoon, I had 3 voicemails from Blake. Each one more desperate than the last. The first was professional, about an administrative oversight. The second was apologetic, saying he hadn't fully understood the contract implications. The third was practically begging. He'd personally recommend reinstating me at my previous salary, plus a 15% increase, if I'd come back immediately. Funny how fast 60-year-olds stop being obsolete when your contract is on the line. I forwarded all 3 voicemails to my personal email for safekeeping, then went back to my newspaper. Tuesday morning, the official notification came. A registered letter from the Department of Defense. Meridian Defense Solutions had been found in material breach of Contract Sentinel-7, Section 4.7.2, due to unauthorized removal of key personnel. The letter gave Meridian 48 hours to cure the breach or face immediate termination for cause. My phone rang 18 times that day. I answered none of them. Wednesday morning, David Jenkins showed up at my house. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Art, he stood on my porch, defeated. They're going to lose the contract. I invited him in, made coffee, and let him talk. The story poured out. Monday had been pandemonium. Blake discovered the key personnel clause around 10 a.m. when the DoD started asking questions. He spent 2 hours insisting it couldn't be enforced. Then 4 hours trying to find a replacement architect with a TS/SCI clearance and 15+ years of defense experience. Turns out, those don't grow on trees. Every qualified candidate was either already employed or required a 6-month clearance transfer. David told me Blake had actually called a headhunting firm and asked if they could fast-track a clearance investigation. The recruiter just laughed. Marcus had confronted Blake in front of the entire leadership team. Demanded to know why he hadn't researched the contract requirements. Blake tried to blame Brenda in HR. Brenda reminded everyone that she'd sent Blake a summary of key personnel designations during his first week. Blake claimed he never received it. The email log said otherwise. The IT team pulled the records. The email had been opened. The attachments downloaded. Blake had even replied with a thumbs-up emoji and the words, "Got it, we'll review." He never reviewed it. Just filed it away, because compliance documentation was boring, legacy thinking. By Tuesday, they were desperate. Calling contractors, headhunters, former employees. They found 3 candidates nationwide who technically qualified. One was retiring, one had a non-compete, and one couldn't start for 90 days. The 48-hour cure period was impossible to meet. David finished his coffee. Looked at me with exhausted eyes. They're going to offer you anything to come back. Marcus authorized up to double your previous salary, plus a signing bonus. Blake's been told to apologize, personally. I set my cup down. David, I appreciate you coming here, but I signed a severance agreement. They paid me to leave quietly. I left quietly. This is different, Art. The whole company is at stake. 340 people could lose their jobs if Sentinel goes away. I felt that one. Those employees hadn't done anything wrong. They were caught in the blast radius of Blake's arrogance and Marcus's negligence. But that wasn't my responsibility anymore. I told David I'd think about it. He nodded, didn't push. Just thanked me for the coffee and left. Eleanor found me on the porch that evening. She'd heard enough of the phone calls to piece things together. "What are you going to do?" "I haven't decided yet." She sat down next to me. "That many people losing their jobs. That's a lot of weight." "It is. But they didn't care about my 31 years when they decided I was too old to matter. Why should I care about their problems now?" She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. Thursday morning, I got a call from someone I didn't expect. Caroline Bell, Meridian's chief legal counsel. We'd worked together on contract negotiations for 15 years. "Arthur," her voice was measured, lawyer calm. "I know you have no obligation to speak with me, but I'm hoping you'll hear me out." I told her I'd listen. She laid it out plainly. The Sentinel contract was terminating at midnight Friday unless they could demonstrate immediate remediation. No other contract could absorb the revenue loss. They'd have to lay off at least 180 people. She understood why I was angry. Kyle had acted without proper authorization, and Marcus had failed in his oversight. Then she made the pitch. "We're prepared to offer you full reinstatement at 2.5 times your previous salary, a 3-year guaranteed contract with termination protection, a formal written apology from Blake Harrison, and a seat on the advisory board." She added, "We're also prepared to remove Blake from any supervisory role over your position. You'd report directly to Marcus." "The same Marcus who sat there and let Blake fire me?" Caroline paused. "Marcus has reconsidered his leadership approach in light of recent events." I told her I needed time to think. She said the deadline was midnight Friday. I understood deadlines. After she hung up, I sat with it. The offer was substantial. More than substantial. It was an acknowledgement that they'd been catastrophically wrong and were willing to pay almost any price to fix it. But here's the thing about being publicly humiliated by someone who thought your age made you worthless. Money doesn't erase that. Titles don't erase that. Even apologies don't really erase that. Blake had laughed when he said I was too old. He'd laughed like it was a joke that everyone understood. Like 60 years of life and 31 years of expertise were punchlines. I called my daughter, Sarah, that afternoon. She lived in Chicago now, a data analyst. Smart kid, always had good instincts. She'd watched me navigate corporate politics her whole life. She listened to the whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Dad," she finally said. "What do you actually want here?" "I want to never see Blake Harrison's face again." "Okay. What else?" "I want them to understand that experience matters, that you can't just throw away decades of knowledge because you're chasing some fantasy about innovation and youth. I want them to feel what it's like to need something they casually discarded." She paused. "But do you want to go back? Like, actually work there again? Wake up every morning and walk into that building, knowing what they did?" I thought about it. The building I'd walked into for 22 years. The desk where I'd solved 1,000 problems. The people I'd mentored. The systems I'd built. The coffee machine in the break room that only I knew how to fix properly. Then I thought about Blake in the next office. Marcus in the corner suite. The HR meeting where they'd handed me a folder and shown me the door. The laugh. That dismissive, arrogant laugh. "No," I said. "I don't think I do." "Then don't," she said, simple, like it was obvious. "They made their choice, Dad. Now they get to live with it. You don't owe them a rescue." "What about the other employees? What about them?" Did any of them stand up for you in that meeting? Did anyone push back on Blake's restructuring? David did afterward. Afterward doesn't count. If they wanted you there, they should have fought for you when it mattered. She had a point. A hard one, but a point. I called Caroline back Thursday evening. Told her I appreciated the offer, but I wasn't interested in returning to Meridian. She was quiet for a long moment. Arthur, you understand what this means? I understand that your company made a decision, and now they're experiencing the consequences. That's not my responsibility to fix. 300 people will lose their jobs. They'll blame Blake and Marcus. Not me, Caroline. I didn't fire myself. I didn't ignore the contract requirements. I didn't laugh at someone's age like it was a disqualification. She didn't have a response for that. Is there anything that would change your mind? I thought about it. I'd consider consulting short-term. Enough to help you find a qualified replacement and manage the transition. But not as an employee. Not under Blake. And not under the terms we discussed. She asked what terms I wanted. Full autonomy over the transition process, a consulting rate of $450 per hour, minimum 6-month engagement regardless of contract outcome, and a written acknowledgement that my termination was improper, distributed to all employees. She said she'd take it to Marcus. Friday morning, 20 hours until the Sentinel contract terminated. Marcus called me personally at 7 a.m. Arthur, his voice was rough, stressed. I've reviewed your consulting proposal, and we accept all terms. Caroline's drafting the agreement now. Can you come in this morning to sign? I told him I'd be there by 10 o'clock. Walking back into Meridian felt strange. The same parking lot, the same security desk, the same elevator bank I'd ridden 1,000 times. But everything felt different. The looks from employees I passed, some sympathetic, some confused, some openly hostile. Kyle's loyalists who still thought the restructuring was the right move. Caroline met me in the lobby, walked me to a conference room on the executive floor. The agreement was already printed. 12 pages of legal protection and financial terms. I read every word, signed every page. Caroline countersigned. I set down the pen. Let's talk about saving your contract. The next 3 hours were a crash course in everything Blake had ignored. I walked them through the key personnel requirements, the notification timelines, the cure provisions, and remediation options. The only path forward was a formal request to Richard Stone for an emergency extension. We need to demonstrate that a qualified replacement was in process and provide a detailed transition timeline. I knew 2 people who might qualify. Both former colleagues, both retired but potentially willing to unretire. I made calls, sent emails, pulled in favors I'd been saving for 15 years. By 4 p.m., we had a candidate. George Adams, 63 years old, TS/SCI cleared, 28 years of defense cybersecurity experience. Retired 18 months ago, but bored out of his mind and happy to take on a new challenge. He could start in 2 weeks, pending administrative clearance transfer. I drafted the emergency extension request myself, detailed the circumstances, acknowledged the breach. Presented the remediation plan with George's credentials and my interim oversight as consulting architect. Richard Stone at the DoD reviewed it personally, called me directly at 8 p.m. Arthur. This is highly irregular. The whole situation is highly irregular, Richard. I'm trying to minimize damage for everyone involved. He was quiet. Then I can grant a 45-day extension contingent on verified progress. If Morrison's clearance transfer hits any delays, we'll need to revisit. I thanked him. I meant it. The contract survived. Barely. Another 24 hours and it would have been dead. I sent the confirmation to Caroline at 8:47 p.m. She responded within minutes. A single line, thank you. That night, I sat with Eleanor on the back porch again, told her about the day. She shook her head. You spent 10 hours fixing a problem they created by firing you. I did. How does that feel? I thought about it. Complicated, satisfying in some ways, frustrating in others. But here's the thing. I didn't do it for Marcus. Didn't do it for Blake. I did it for the 300 people who needed jobs and the 20 years of relationships I'd built with colleagues who deserved better than to be collateral damage. And I did it on my terms, at my rate, with my name cleared and my value documented in writing. That matters more than revenge, at least to me. The next 6 weeks were educational for everyone. I came in 3 days a week as a consultant. Set my own hours, reported to no one except the contract requirements. Blake avoided me like I was radioactive. Whenever I walked into a room, he found a reason to leave. Whenever we passed in the hallway, he studied his phone like it contained classified information, which, professionally speaking, I kind of was. The guy who'd almost cost the company everything. The cautionary tale that senior leadership referenced in every planning meeting. George Adams's clearance transfer came through on schedule. Good man, thorough, methodical, exactly what the Sentinel contract needed. He'd spent 28 years doing the same kind of work I'd done. Knew the rhythms, understood the stakes. We had lunch together his first week, swapped war stories. This is how it's supposed to work, he said. Experience teaching experience, knowledge transferring properly. I agreed. Wished Blake had understood that. I spent most of my consulting hours documenting processes that existed only in my head. 22 years of institutional knowledge converted into procedures and playbooks that anyone could follow. The vendor relationships, the compliance shortcuts that weren't actually shortcuts, but looked like them to outsiders. The historical context for decisions that seemed arbitrary but actually prevented specific documented problems. It should have been done years ago. It would have been if Blake hadn't decided that documentation was bureaucratic overhead instead of organizational survival. The employees noticed the shift. People who'd been afraid to speak up during Blake's restructuring started asking questions again, pushing back on changes that didn't make sense, citing compliance requirements that the new regime had ignored. David Jenkins stopped by my temporary office one afternoon. Blake's losing support, he said, looking almost hopeful. The board is asking questions about how this happened. Marcus is distancing himself. I'd heard similar things. Corporate survival instincts kicking in. When a $17 million contract nearly evaporates because of one director's arrogance, people start looking for someone to blame. Blake was the obvious target. But Marcus had enabled him, hired him without proper vetting, approved the restructuring without checking contract implications. Had sat in that termination meeting and said nothing while Blake laughed about my age. They were both going to face consequences eventually. 3 weeks into my consulting engagement, Marcus announced that Blake Harrison was transitioning to a special projects role. No longer IT director, no longer managing any personnel, just working on undefined initiatives that everyone understood meant waiting out his severance clock. Blake's LinkedIn updated the same day, innovation strategist. Same company, different reality. He never apologized to me directly. The written apology Caroline had promised came from HR on company letterhead. Corporate language, zero personal accountability. I framed it anyway. Hung it next to my Air Force commendation plaque. Week 5 brought another development. The board hired an outside firm to audit Meridian's contract compliance process. Standard response to a near miss of this magnitude. The auditor spent 3 weeks reviewing documentation, interviewing employees, mapping personnel changes against contract requirements. They found 17 other contracts with key personnel gaps or notification issues. Nothing as severe as Sentinel, but problems that would have surfaced eventually. Blake's fingerprints were on most of them. His restructuring had moved people around without checking contractual constraints. His push for efficiency had eliminated documentation that turned out to be legally required. His assumption that government contracting worked like Austin, Texas, startups had created a minefield of compliance violations. The audit report was devastating. 63 pages of findings, 12 recommendations for immediate remediation. It landed on Marcus's desk like a bomb. He tried to spin it as institutional issues that predated his tenure. The auditors had included a section specifically addressing that defense. Most of the problems had been created in the past 9 months. All of them were traceable to specific decisions made by Blake and approved by Marcus. Within 48 hours, the board announced that Marcus Thorne was stepping down as CEO to pursue other opportunities. Code 4, you're fired, but we're letting you pretend otherwise. His replacement was Valerie Hayes, the COO for 12 years. Solid, experienced, actually understood how government contracting worked. Her first act as CEO was to call me personally. "Arthur," she said, "I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong. Not just procedurally wrong, ethically wrong." I appreciated that. "I also want you to know that Blake's special projects role is ending. He's being terminated for cause based on the audit findings. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Finally, I want to offer you something. Not reinstatement. I know you're not interested. But a permanent consulting arrangement. Advisory role on all major contract decisions. Your rate, your hours, your terms." I told her I'd think about it, and this time I actually meant it. Valerie was different. She'd earned her position through decades of competence, not MBA credentials and boardroom politics. She understood that age meant experience, not obsolescence. The Friday of my last official consulting week, I got an unexpected visitor. Blake Harrison appeared in my doorway. First time he'd approached me since the day he'd taken my badge. He looked diminished somehow, smaller. The confidence that had radiated off him 3 months ago was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Mr. Miller," he said. "Do you have a minute?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat down, didn't make eye contact right away. I wanted to apologize. His voice was quieter than I remembered. Not for the company letter. Personally. For what I said in that meeting. I waited. Let him sit in the silence. I was arrogant. He finally looked up. I thought I understood this industry because I understood technology. Turns out technology is maybe 20% of what actually matters here. The other 80% is relationships and compliance and institutional knowledge. Things that take decades to build. True. He swallowed. The age comment. That was inexcusable. I looked at your experience and saw something outdated instead of seeing what it actually was. I was wrong. I studied him for a moment. This was either genuine growth or a calculated attempt to improve his professional reputation before hitting the job market. Maybe both. Blake, I appreciate the apology. Genuinely. But here's what I want you to understand. He nodded, listening. When you laughed about my age, you weren't just insulting me. You were dismissing everything I'd built. Every late night solving problems, every crisis averted, every relationship cultivated over 30 years. You reduced all of that to a number and decided it made me worthless. He looked down again. That's not something an apology fixes. That's something you carry. And hopefully, it changes how you approach people in the future. Because somewhere out there is another 60-year-old with 30 years of knowledge that you're going to need someday. And how you treat that person will define who you actually are. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. Thank you for hearing me out. He walked out. I never saw him again. 2 weeks later, I heard he'd landed at a mid-sized consulting firm in Kansas City, Missouri. Lower title, lower salary, building back from scratch. Some lessons you have to learn the hard way. 6 months after my termination, things looked very different. Valerie Hayes had stabilized Meridian. The Sentinel contract was renewed for another 3 years with George Adams as the primary architect. The compliance audit had led to comprehensive process reforms across every department. I'd accepted Valerie's consulting offer, 8 hours a week, advisory role on contract strategy and key personnel decisions. My rate stayed at $450 per hour. One afternoon, Valerie called me into her office. "We're considering a new IT director hire." She slid a resume across the desk. "What do you think?" I reviewed it. 46 years old, government background, 8 years at a different defense contractor, 0 Austin, Texas, experience. Looks solid. She hired him the following week. His name was Michael Vance. First thing he did was schedule one-on-ones with every senior technical employee. Second thing he did was read every active contract cover to cover. Third thing he did was ask me to lunch. "I hear you're the reason this company still exists," he said over sandwiches. "I'm the reason the Sentinel contract still exists. The company existing was a side effect." He laughed. "Fair enough. I also heard about the guy before me, Blake Harrison." "Yeah." Michael shook his head. "I looked him up. He's at some consulting firm in Kansas City now. Junior role. Barely making 6 figures. Sounds about right." Michael leaned back. "You know what's funny? I applied for the IT director job here 8 months ago, before Blake got it." I set my sandwich down. "You're kidding." "Nope. HR told me my background was too traditional. They wanted someone who could modernize the department. And now here you are. And now here I am, cleaning up the mess that modernization created." 3 months later, I got a letter in the mail. Formal correspondence from the Department of Defense. Commendation for my role in preserving the Sentinel contract and managing the transition to a new architect. Signed by Richard Stone personally. I framed it. Hung it next to the corporate apology letter and the Air Force plaque. A week after that, David Jenkins got promoted to senior systems engineer. He called to tell me the news. Valerie said she wanted people with institutional knowledge in leadership positions. He sounded almost emotional. "She said you recommended me." "I did." "You earned it, David. Thanks for everything. Just do the job right." That's all the thanks I need. The following month, Meridian won a new contract. $23 million over 5 years, cybersecurity infrastructure for a different military branch. Richard Stone had recommended us based on how we'd handled the Sentinel crisis. Valerie called me personally with the news. "Arthur, we got it. Congratulations." "No." She paused. "Thank you." The DoD specifically cited our crisis response and transition planning as factors in their decision. "That was your work. I just did what needed doing. You did more than that. You could have walked away. Let us fail. Nobody would have blamed you. Maybe not. But 300 people would have lost their jobs." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to put your name on the new contract. As a senior advisor. Paid position. Full benefits if you want them." I told her I'd think about it. That evening, Eleanor and I had dinner on the back porch. I told her about the new contract, the offer, the commendation letter. She smiled. "So, what are you going to do?" "Probably take the advisor position. Work a few more years, help them build something that'll last after I'm gone." "And then?" "Then what?" "And then, does it ever really end, this dance between wisdom and ambition?"